Estás viendo Canal América, televisión dominicana para el mundo.
Time for True Show is sponsored by the Office of Dr. Bernard Fialkoff, a periodontal, dental implant and laser specialist in New York City, for over 40 years. Dr. Fialkoff was honored by the International College of Dentists and Pierre Fauchard, and received the Presidential Lifetime Humanitarian Honor from the White House. Call us at 718-229-3838.
Sometimes life can be so damn hard. You don't know where to go. Everything keeps falling apart. Yeah. You try to do your best, but only God knows that you've given everything you've got, but the world takes you down. You just keep moving on. Let your fears.
Welcome to a Time for True show. I'm your host, Dr. Bernard Fialkoff, and I welcome you back with us for our next segment. And, you know, we have to take a look, especially after COVID and so much of the stress that we've been through, as to how are we going to move forward? What needs to change? What hasn't worked? What has the science shown recently and over a period of time? And it's very interesting because when we look at human happiness and prosperity and security, and we want to decrease violence, and we want to decrease drug abuse, we've got to take a look that in our country, 1 out of 5 Americans, and you're talking about 20%, which out of about 330 million or so Americans, you're talking about 60-something million Americans, 1 out of 5, that take some kind of psychiatric drug. About 60-something million Americans on a psychiatric drug of some type. Very, very high number. So we're looking at like tremendous amount of people with stress, anxiety, unhappy, and medicated. And we look at the things going on in our country and we say, are they correlated? Is there some association? And are we moving forward, or are we treading against the tide? What is happening? And so tonight we're going to cover some interesting topics, and we'll start with the first image regarding this drug utilization to treat stress, to treat anxiety, to treat, depression. And let's take a look at a little bit of history. We see that in the early 1980s, psychiatric disorders were supposedly found to be discrete brain illnesses caused by chemical imbalances. And so this was the advent of, well, if we have an imbalance, let's take a drug, and it should cure it, like you would take, insulin for diabetes or an antibiotic for an infection. So this seemed to be plausible. Let's go to the next slide. And we started to see that there was a large increase in the usage of these psychiatric drugs. And supposedly, by using these drugs, we were going to put their brain back in order and take care of the insanity, the depression, the anxiety, or what's called attention deficit disorder, and that these drugs would do so. Let's go to the next slide. And so that was what was proposed. But what was very interesting, that as of years have gone on and more research was done, then this biology or supposed biology or genetics of these psychiatric disorders was not found. It remained unknown. And it didn't seem like it was panning out to lead to a causative point. And then there was a diagnostic study manual. This manual, scientific manual, was utilized, the DSM, to classify supposed different illnesses. And that according to the illness, then there was a certain treatment. But what's been found is that it's not a simple thing of just increasing or decreasing neurotransmitters such as serotonin or dopamine, because we have the selective serotonin uptake inhibitors, supposedly to leave more serotonin in the gap and create more excitement or energy or positive feeling. But yet the studies didn't bear that out. In some cases showed that there was depression with the increased serotonin. And it was very interesting because it wasn't a simple positive or negative, and that the drugs did affect neurotransmitter functions, but the neurotransmitter functions were very complicated. It wasn't a simple thing of just adding more water to the cement to make it looser mix. It wasn't that simplistic an idea, and this was starting to be realized and found out. So let's go to the next slide. And as we did that, then we started to question our philosophy or this supposed philosophy of treatment. So what's very interesting is that over the years, actually in modern times now, we've had an increase in the mental illness, whereas years ago, when we weren't using as many drugs, there was less mental illness. Also, we have to take a look at the years ago, possibly the society was in a different state, so that there were probable factors in terms of the community, the security, the lessened stress that were causing a lesser mental illness state or mental wellness state, which is a new popular term. And what we started to see is that there were poor long-term functional outcomes for those people who were continuously medicated. In other words, that they continuously, let's say, had Prozac or Haldol or some other SSRI, serotonin uptake inhibitor. But these people on long-term treatment didn't fare well. Let's go to the next slide. So more questions came up, and we started wondering, well, are we really on the right track with this chemical imbalance theory? And it seemed like it wasn't. And so we started looking at where success was occurring and what other factors a human being would respond to. And since it seemed like years ago there was a lesser mental illness rate, we started looking and saying, well, possibly there should be more of an insight or emphasis on that person's coordination with his friends, with his community, with his family. And it's very interesting because in the country of Finland, they established a group called Open Dialogue. Open Dialogue. Communication, interaction, which is very interesting because during COVID, it was found that the isolation caused an increase in stress, that the isolation caused an increase in disease states. I'm talking about physical disease states, not mental, but physical disease states increased during COVID because of the lack of human contact, which was a positive thing about COVID, which showed us that there was a factor of human interaction and that energy that we feel when we're with a loved one or a good friend of ours or have a good occasion wasn't imaginary, that it actually did something, because when we removed it during COVID, people were getting physically sick, aside from mentally stressed. Also, we found out that isolation caused an increase in the marijuana usage, in the alcohol usage, about 40 to 50% globally during COVID, which is studied again and surveyed scientifically. So again, we were seeing this, and it's very interesting because then in recent months, the Surgeon General of the United States came out with a statement, and the Surgeon General McMurthy basically stated that we had an epidemic of loneliness and isolation, and that epidemic, he found as a physician, was causing physical ailments, increased mortality, so increased death rate, lessened health. And he went on further to state that the Surgeon General found that it was causing community illnesses. What are community illnesses? That he found that some of the violence that we were undergoing, the drug increase that we were undergoing, the homelessness, the economic stresses in our communities, the lack of security, many different factors seem to be correlated to this epidemic of loneliness and isolation. And what did the Surgeon General go on to state is that not only that we had an opportunity to fix this with increased social interaction, increased familial interaction and communication, which you could find in his advisory online where he states this, but he went on to state that not only was it an opportunity, but it was our duty as citizens of the country, and obviously as health practitioners, it was our duty to use this newfound information to help cure our communities and our citizens and our friends and family. So it's very interesting because in Finland, they did just that with successful emphasis on family and community, as our Surgeon General so aptly advised about 4 or 5 months ago. Very, very interesting. And when you think about it and you realize how at weddings and good occasions, there are just very good, what we call good vibes, good energy in the environment. And we sleep well that night. And maybe we don't snore as much. And it seems like our sleep apnea decreased. And that we woke up more refreshed, even though we woke up earlier. And that somehow that energy was related to our stress level. That maybe the fact that the highway traffic and being stuck here in New York on the Long Island Expressway for 45 minutes and traffic jams with horns blaring, with people getting anxious and upset, that it had an effect on us. Very, very interesting. And then we look further and we see that in Norway, another country in Scandinavia, in Norway, the hospital districts actually created medication-free treatments for mental illness. Very, very interesting that in both of these countries, this was found to be very successful. That the person's social interaction, life interaction, and his daily routine was causing an improved mental wellness. And it's very interesting because which country is noted as the happiest country in the world? And I gave you a hint at the top. Finland. Finland is known as the country with the happiest people on earth. So it's very interesting that their method, that their philosophy, not only lent itself within their treatment centers, but actually throughout the entire country. So that the entire country had good vibes, had happiness, and I'm sure decreased violence, decreased murder, decreased drug usage. Because when you're happy, the body releases normally endorphins. Endorphins are natural hormones that physiologically exist in the human body. Another interesting thing is that when a person is less stressed, their own serotonin levels go up naturally. And the serotonin level keeps the person happier. And they interact with neurotransmitters because, as I said, it's not a simple factor, it's a complicated neurotransmitter factors. We're very complicated creatures, human beings, and it's a miracle. Our lives are, and life is a miracle. Let's go on to the next slide as we delve further into these new findings. And as we do, we see that even in the country of Israel, we have something called soteria houses. What are soteria houses? Soteria houses, which again are used to treat mental health problems or to treat happiness or stress problems, are supportive residential environments. And that being the principal therapy or the principal approach that they use in the country of Israel to treat mental health, to create an environment where in the residence there's social interaction, where each one is helping the other, where each one has a mission and has a purpose in their life, and they have something to look forward to. And if you really look at it, it would seem to make sense. And when you think about the fact of how when you really had something that excited you, as I just said, you were excited. You had more energy. Maybe somebody teased you and said, well, what are you so happy about? You know, it's going to come to an end. A little bit of pessimism. So does it really need to come to an end? And, you know, so they concentrated on this residential positive environment, which would mean eliminating negative influences, which sometimes in our lives we have to take a look at. Unfortunately, there are certain people around us who can be negative. So we need to take a look and maybe not have that negativity and decide what we're going to do about those negativities, whether it be people, occupations, or connections that we have. Let's go on. We go on to the next slide, and we'll see further that a doctor who actually was in the United Nations for 5 years, and here we go, and he was the UN Special Rapporteur for Health, Dr. Danius Puras, MD. And Dr. Puras called for what he said it was a revolution in mental health. Why a revolution? Well, because he felt that we should replace or supplant the supposed biological paradigm, the chemical imbalance theory, that should be replaced. That being his opinion, just being a communicator of his expertise as a physician and mental health counselor and UN Special Rapporteur, that it should be a different approach, because what was happening in Finland, what was happening in Norway, what was happening in Israel, And what he proposed was that we should get more involved in our social interactions and the justice factors in our society. Justice factors meaning the right to education, to feel that you can improve your life, that you have some control over your future, that you have some control over your stress, that you have a way of creating in your life and taking care of yourself so that you can survive better, that you will be able to have a job, an occupation, a profession, and social factors of having that profession so that you could pay your bills, not be in the stress of debt and tremendous credit card bills, which has plagued so many in our country here in the United States, and the stress levels of having a credit card with 10%, 15%, 20% interest rates compounding monthly, exorbitant, tremendous stress levels. And some of our professional students who, by the time they get done with their education, have accumulated $250,000, $500,000 in debt before they even have an opportunity to start practicing, this being dentistry, which is my profession. Obviously, that creates tremendous amount of economic stress on that individual. This is something that Dr. Porras mentioned. They're not in poverty, but are they not in poverty? What is the definition of poverty? Or is it just stressed economically? Does it even matter? And then we have inequality, which then we get into prejudice and bigotry and dealing with things that sometimes in our societies we tend to ignore, that somehow we feel they're going to magically disappear without communication. And basically the studies have showed that that's not true. And it seemed like that we went away from our duty as human beings to interact, to communicate, and to make a better environment socially and collaboratively, that we started getting more illness. When we went away from responsibility and we went to more drugs, we went away from an active and causative viewpoint to a more victim-y, patient type of mental illness where we've lost control and we have our society with the tremendous problems that we're seeing. So it's very interesting that Dr. Porras spotted all this and called for the revolution to minimize these life stresses and to improve our social justice. Let's go on to the next slide. And what we find is, as we've looked at all of this, that we see that what we had assumed is not true. That the illnesses in this diagnostic manual have not been validated. In fact, if you look at some of them, if you're just a very excited person, you could have an excitable illness disorder. And if you were to lose a loved one, you have some kind of depressive disorder, whereas what you need is bereavement. And what in all religions we have, which is a period of grieving for the lost one, of getting over the loss, which is important. The other thing is that the genetics of mental disorders still has never been proven and remains in doubt. And it's the fact of doing MRI scans really hasn't proven useful. That the longer-term outcomes of this drug care are poor. And very interestingly, that the very former editor of the Psychiatric Times, Dr. Ronald Peace, stated that really psychiatry didn't really, or was not really for this chemical imbalance theory. He tried to distance psychiatry from this chemical imbalance theory. Very interesting, showing the failure of that theory and the ever-increasing evidence that a human being seems to have a social structure, that these energies and positive feelings and duties and missions and purposes have an effect on all of us, and that we really are human beings, as it says in the dictionary, that we're a spiritual being. Let's go on to the next slide. And so what happened as this is going on, we've come to other conclusions, and very interesting, because according to this DSM book, anyone that was too emotional or just didn't like being bored, well, you were attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and you were a candidate for treatment. But if we look back at our early years and our creative artists and people who bring life to the world and illusion and imagery and future, Shakespeare, Mark Twain, Ernest Hemingway, we see that, yes, human beings have minds. Yes, we have emotions. Sometimes we get angry. Sometimes we get happy. Sometimes we get sad. But that's a normal reaction of a human being as he encounters different stimuli in the environment. The environment is not always a happy one, unfortunately. But it creates a challenge. It's a game to play. And so human beings have emotions and behaviors, and they change in the course of time, in the course of a person's life. And it's a common occurrence. It's not a DSM mental illness. Let's go on to the next slide. And so with that in mind, then we take a look and we say, well, that's true. So maybe we should concentrate more on allowing ourselves a little more freedom to be, not being so judgmental of ourselves and of others. And if we go to the next slide, please, engineer, and we can see that we have a lot more that goes on. Let's take a look at this from Tim Robbins. It says, we're medicating all of the future artists, rock and rollers, and you're not going to see that burning rage that you need to see in art. It's just going to be medicated. Such a true comment. Do we go to Broadway to be put to sleep? Do we go to a concert to have Carlos Vives wake us up or put us into a coma or to sleep? No, I don't think so. Or that we have to drink more coffee to hear him. I don't think so. We go there to have fun, to hear the Beatles, to hear Frank Sinatra, to hear Madonna, to hear Julio Iglesias, Ricky Martin, whoever your favorite singer is. My friend Judy Bachar. Let's go to the next slide. And so we see that things have been changing, and we've been realizing that we want life to be exciting, and that we want to have our own individual ability to respond. That we want to replace this being chemically and physically treated with an ability to be us, with more happiness in our lives, and a real integration into the community and happiness occurring. Next slide. As we've seen, has occurred with the number one country. I guess they get the gold medal. If we were going to have an Olympics of happiness and positive energy, and we would go to the next slide, engineer, it would be Finland. There you go. And there are the Finnish people, the number one country who believes in interacting with each other and having a sense of community, of doing good deeds, not just for themselves in a selfish way, but so the community can prosper and to have a purpose in their lives. And you see them there in the picture. Doesn't need to be described. A beautiful feeling. Let's go on to the next slide. And what I wanted to tell you is that we're very lucky that in New York, for the next few days, we have an exhibit where you can find out about how you can encourage a child's curiosity, how you can find new realities and realize what's been happening that's been taking it away. Let's go on to the next slide. And this is an exhibit from a commission called the Citizens Commission on Human Rights. And in Union Square, tonight, tomorrow, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, it ends Thursday night at 9 p.m. But up until 9 p.m., you can come visit. It's a free exhibit, and you can see and find out some of these different factors that we've discussed in the show. And find out for yourself what we need to change, what is being changed, why we've gotten to this situation in our country, in our world. I've shown you what's been happening in different countries that have gone to a more social human being approach. So visit the exhibit. I encourage you to do so. You'll find out different factors that you probably will want to get involved in. And why? Because now you have a reason. It would give you a challenge. It would give you something positive, good deeds for others, social interaction and integration, applying what they found in Finland, in Norway, in Israel. So I hope you found this very interesting. I hope you find the exhibit CCHR on Union Square interesting. And if you enjoy it, let us know at a timefortruthshow@gmail.com. More than happy to get your comments. Have a very good night, and I hope that you have a very good year. Be well.
This show was sponsored by A Time for Truth Foundation Incorporated as a community service.
Sometimes life can be so damn hard. You don't know where to go. Everything keeps falling apart. Yeah. You try to do your best, but only God knows that you've given everything you've got, but the world takes you down. You just keep moving on. Let your feet